Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gillian Howell, Head of Client Advisory Solutions at Foundation Source, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion on strategic giving in times of crisis. So let me share a little bit of information on Foundation Source and who we are, a firm I had the honor of joining 6 months ago after a 31-year career leading philanthropic solutions at Bank of America. So we're the nation's largest provider of specialized support services for family and corporate foundations. And today we work with more than 2,000 foundations to help them bring their philanthropic visions to life through a combination of administrative, compliance, technology, and advisory services. And these capabilities allow philanthropists like yourself to focus on strategy and the joy of giving, if you will, by being, having safe in the knowledge that your foundations are running smoothly and compliantly. Today's discussion promises to be both informative and thought-provoking. We all know disaster is both widespread and constant. We're also in the third year of a global pandemic, and as of today, we're on day 90 of the Russian-Ukraine conflict, and we're entering the season for increased weather-related disasters. All these events leave in their wake widespread suffering that takes a lasting toll in our communities. All of you today, as philanthropists on the phone, are in a unique position to help, but let's face it, this is a complex landscape, and we struggle to figure out what the right kind of support is and what that looks like. Well, we're hoping that today will shed light on these complexities and struggles and better help you effectively address with your giving these very important issues. We will focus on some high-level themes today: what makes giving in times of crisis different than other charitable giving, how the needs and resilience have changed due to the current challenges and dynamics, what you as funders should be thinking about now, and sharing some best practices there, advice and guidance, and how funders can respond quickly and creatively in times of this great need. So I'm privileged today to be joined by three individuals who have tremendous amount of experience and expertise in this space. First, Zach Rosenberg co-founded St. Bernard Project, which is SBP, social impact organization focused on disaster resilience and recovery. And their mission at SBP is to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. Zach advises local and state government officials to create long-term recovery programs and has been recognized as one of the 2018 Social Entrepreneurs of the Year by the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship. Will McNulty is the co-founder of Team Rubicon, a nonprofit that utilizes the skills and experiences of military veterans with first responders to rapidly deploy emergency response teams. And their mission is providing relief to those affected by a disaster, no matter when or where they strike. He is currently head of mission at Operation White Stork, which is supported by Ukraine Friends, which has been conducting evacuation, IFA case supply, and medical training operations in the Ukraine since February 28th. Will has worked in support of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Council's Iraq Threat Finance Cell. Jeff Haskell is my partner at Foundation Source. He's the Chief Legal Officer there. He's responsible for providing guidance on legal and tax issues to the firm's foundation clients and their professional teams, as well as an extensive in-house team of attorneys, accountants, and service professionals who provide tax reporting and operational support. His articles have appeared in Trust and Estates and Taxation of Exempts magazines and in the Cardozo Law Review. Additionally, he is a frequent speaker on the rules and regulations pertaining to private foundations. So some quick housekeeping. Questions can be submitted at any time through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Don't put your questions in the chat box, put them in the Q&A icon. And we'll hope to reserve some time at the end, the last 10 minutes, to go through those questions. If we do not have time to answer all of your questions, please know that we will follow up directly with you following our webinar. So thank you very much, panel. Now let's dig in. First, I'm going to turn to you, Zach, and then I'll turn to Will. But I want you to give some background on you and your organization and your operations.
Sure, Jillian, thank you for having us. And I'm really honored to be with Jeff and Will today. This is, yeah, I've been a fan of Will's work since I first came to know him, and truly, there's no other guy or entity he's involved with that I know that both runs towards the fire, but then is thoughtful about solving the problems, not just putting Band-Aids on things. SBP started born out of Hurricane Katrina, without a clear background or history in the work that we're doing. I was a lawyer, my wife was an educator, and we saw American citizens who had achieved an element of success. They owned homes, but they were staring into this abyss of uncertainty. Over the years, was spread to 16 communities around the country. And as much as we're rebuilding houses in any community where we exist, we've rebuilt more houses than any other organization. We've identified that the real answer, if we care about the client base, isn't rebuilding more houses, but obviating the need for the rebuilding work in the first place. And that is what centers SBPs work. The reason for it is pretty clear. You know, first of all, home is both the tipping point between upward economic mobility and negative generational impact. Also, and unfortunately, as we've all found through COVID, home means so much more than we ever thought it did before. It's a place where we're told to be safe, where we educate our kids. It's a place of worship at times. The gym, home is multi-purpose. We've got to protect it and secure it for people. It's a fact that, at least in America, disasters are disproportionately impacting those who are under-resourced. And there is a real and clear, as we'll talk about in just a sec, racially disparate impact here. As you said, Jillian, climate change is causing more broad, stronger, and more severe weather. And at the end of the day, too many people are at risk of being pushed beyond their breaking point. Will, the folks are here working in our yard. I'm going to cause them to stop. So why don't you hop in, and I'm going to see if I can stop that foul noise occurring outside. Pardon me.
Sure. Thanks, Zach. And Zach Rosenberg has been an incredible supporter, always lifting up others around him, including Team Rubicon when we were just a young organization, making key introductions. And he's done the same thing here as I'm now the head of mission for Operation White Stork, which is an organization that's made up of a group of veterans, operators, and other professionals who were just offended and motivated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now have built an organization that we are targeting critical, aid to the front lines across Ukraine, as well as conducting evacuations. We have conducted over 22,000 evacuated so far. You can see on this screen, this slide here, that the majority of these are women and children, because the men 18 to 60 have been conscripted into the military service. We're also about 1,000 pets. So you can see we've evacuated some rats and squirrels this week. If we go to the next slide. This is where the women and children over the past week are primarily coming from. So you can see that the majority of them are coming from Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Kherson Oblast in the south, with a significant amount coming from Kyiv as well. Next slide. And in addition to the evacuations through our partner organization, we have with Ukraine Friends and Airbnb, we are offering 30 free days of temporary housing anywhere in the world except in Ukraine and Russia. We've housed about 12,000 so far. The majority of them are choosing Poland and Poland or Germany, over 60% approximately, for their stays. We'll start doing repatriations in terms of bringing them back here real soon. In addition to that, we provide individual first aid kits to the front lines. We have supplied approximately 4% of what the Ukrainian military requested at the beginning of the war, which was 400,000. We've supplied approximately 4% of that right now, and that's in partnership with our friends over at Ukraine Friends, who are some medical supply entrepreneurs who've helped us, run this operation. Zach, back to you now that you have put an end to the terrorists outside.
Oh my goodness. Can you hear me now? Okay, folks. Thumbs up. Jillian, can you hear me?
Yes, all set. Can hear you perfectly.
Okay, terrific. So I'll move through just a little bit quicker. So after doing the work for quite a while, we realized that while SBP has rebuilt thousands of houses, it's not what we really exist for. And we've determined that after disaster, people are at risk of being pushed beyond their breaking point. And the breaking point is the point when people will never be the same. Some people pass away, lack of hope, fear death due to their living situations. Others are alive but not living. You have seniors whose golden years are forever tarnished, and kids whose formative years are unoptimized. And we figured out that there's 3 levers to the breaking point. And we think this is a framework not just for SBP, but for philanthropists interested in disaster. You know, if you care about mental health, if you care about kids learning and domestic violence and families being ready to thrive, you care about disaster recovery, and if you get it right, you're not preventing the bad, but you're optimizing the good. And so the breaking point's tied to 3 things, and we try and press on each and every one of these levers. And we think philanthropists can pay attention to them too. One is the amount of time between disaster and recovery. The next is the lack of predictability, or the existence of predictability. Humans are resilient. To the extent we have a clear path forward, we can fortify ourselves and really deal with challenging situations. And then finally, what we call vertical resilience, or in other words, access to resources. We're on the slide where Jillian is now. You can see where money is raised and the purposes that it has, and far outsized from recovery or resilience. You'll see that response is by far the greatest, where most of the money is raised for and intended and invested. And it's SBP's belief that while response is important, long-term sustainability and positioning people to be their best selves and avoid being pushed beyond the breaking point is driven through resilience, and it's driven through long-term recovery. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that short-term recovery really ends within 2 or 3 weeks, but it's the intermediate and long-term recovery that's really crucial to whether families are going to get pushed off that cliff or again be positioned to endure. And because of disparate access to resources, because in America of traditional policies that have a racially disparate impact, families with fewer resources without help in the long-term recovery are going to be in a fundamentally worse financial situation than they were otherwise. And I think we have one quick slide that I won't walk through that talks about the racially disparate impact of disaster recovery.
I don't see that, Zach, unless I missed it.
All right, there it is.
There it is.
Yeah, let me just, and we'll send this out to folks if they want, but through the FEMA National Advisory Committee, that was a bipartisan group, has concluded that after disaster, where significant amounts of FEMA funds have been invested, it works for some. Caucasian families, by and large, enjoy an increase in net worth, while families of color suffer a decrease in net worth. And if you think about that, the goal here isn't to make it worse for white people, but instead to make disaster recovery work for everybody. And that's a very important lens. It's an opportunity for philanthropy to inject to ensure that everybody can ensure a successful recovery. So thank you for the time for the introduction.
Great. It's also, I think, I'll stop sharing, a perfect segue into, because I'd like to turn now to what makes disaster giving or giving in times of crisis different from other charitable giving. Really emphasis, as you said, Zach, on both the short term or the emergency nature of it, and also the need to focus on the long term. So I'll turn to you, Will, first, and then if Zach, if you could follow in.
I'm going to build off Zach's slide because there's charities must raise funds to operate, and there's a limited window for when donors are feeling really generous. And that window of interest is very much tied to the media cycle. And so donations significantly drop off when the media loses interest or moves on. And so my recommendation for those who are more careful and considerate with their funds is patience, and maybe wait a few weeks to see which organizations are really delivering impact, because we really need to spread out giving across the entire cycle, and not just have people experience donor fatigue right away because they've given in the first few days of a disaster. So I think right now we're experiencing, for instance, in Ukraine, a significant amount of donor fatigue. I hear a lot of companies already, having made their donation in the first few days. And there's a significant need right now in Ukraine. And the second thing is just to not just bet on organizations, but also people. White Stork operates under a fiscal sponsorship. That's because none of us who are currently in Ukraine expected we would be doing this. We flew over a few days after the invasion, conducted a needs assessment, and are delivering on some critical needs. But we're not an established 501c3. We operate under the fiscal sponsorship of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. So there are a lot of good organizations actually over there right now doing that same thing, operating under fiscal sponsorships, and that's an opportunity.
Zach, if I could, I know I want you to talk a little bit about the short and long term as well, but also you and I have spoken about the difference between giving to established versus emerging nonprofits, which is Will was just speaking to now. And I know there's room for both, and I know you have extensive experience at that with SBP. So you could also kind of opine there too. That I think that would be very helpful for everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Jillian. And I'll start there. I think it's essential for intentional philanthropists to bring their business mindset to the world of philanthropy. Without a doubt, and SBPs, without a doubt, it is important to consider established charity navigator vetted organizations. That's a good screening tool. To be sure, it's an exceptional screening tool. I suggest in times of crisis, in times of war, we bring an entrepreneur's and investor's mindset where you can look for other indicia of success. And I've written about this, and I've really thought about Will and his group. Will's group has zero track record operating in a war in Ukraine, because this is the first time recently there's been a war in Ukraine. Can't find them on Charity Navigator. They don't have 990s, no tax returns, no proof points, except for recently. However, if you look at the sort of indicia that an investor would look into funding a new business, it's all there in spades. You have leadership who has done it before at scale. Will founded Team Rubicon, which is in many ways the biggest response and to some extent recovery organization in America. Will has built a team, a leadership team. So you look at the leadership team of others who have operated in similar environments, and their experience in the military make them uniquely positioned to thrive and deliver results. They have business purpose that is focused and clear and limited. There's no overreach here. They started doing 2 things, now they're doing 3 things once they had their initial proof points. Oftentimes, and so then you look at it in 2 ways. In philanthropy, in the nonprofit world, a number of institutionalized funders would say, I'm sorry, we can't fund you. There's no track record there. I suggest for Operation White Stork and other entities, however, and in crisis in general, we look to other indicia of future success. An investor would say, I have no choice but to invest in you if I truly care about results. And so zooming back out, and SBP has been on both sides of this. I mean, we were a lawyer and a teacher with no nonprofit experience, no experience in disaster recovery, and certainly no experience in construction. But we had a very clear mission, and we had no fidelity to the established, frankly, would say mediocre way of doing things. And we had early investors. The guy who ran the United Way of New Orleans for many years, we thought he was wowed by our business plan. He kind of broke it to us 5 years in. And he said we had no other option. What we were doing wasn't working. And so when we're investing after disasters, in crisis, in war times, I suggest that our allegiance has to be towards results, towards the kind of unthinkable human toll that will occur if we're not willing to bear a little risk. And as I was preparing and talking to my wife this morning and kind of looking back at SBP, It was the investments that it was financial and, financial and business advice, financial and relationships, financial and capacity building. And when I look at our earliest funders like Zurich and Toyota, and some really generous individuals, they invested financially, but they also brought their business expertise and skills to make the entity better. And so I hope that answers your question. Let me, in a nutshell, Jillian, I think we can't afford to play it safe.
Mm-hmm.
We have to, if we really care about the client base, I'm not saying be risky, but bring a robust lens, the same lens that would bring to our business world, and make bets that show loyalty to results, not just comfort.
Great, thanks, Zach. Jeff, keeping with this theme of emergency giving, long-term, short-term, we know foundations can be very nimble during these times of crisis, and that includes giving to individuals and even giving to for-profit organizations. Can you provide maybe some key considerations for foundations if they're thinking of this kind of giving?
Sure, Jillian, thanks. Well, starting with the basics, although some grants individuals require the IRS's advance approval, grants given to individuals to relieve the stress, like disaster relief, emergency, medical, or hardship assistance, do not. And while advance approval isn't needed here, the IRS still requires that grant recipients be selected from an open-ended group of individuals known as a broad charitable class. The group has to be indefinite or large enough to ensure that the number of members comprising the group isn't fixed. Another IRS rule provides that charitable funds shouldn't be distributed to individuals just because they're the victims of a disaster. According to the IRS, a foundation providing emergency or distress relief must make a specific assessment that a recipient of aid is in need. And in that vein, when granting outside of the US, the foundation should take into account the local cost of living and currency values relative to the dollar to tailor the grant amount to the recipient's needs. In any event, the grant amount should vary from one person to another, depending on each person's level of need. After all, even amongst the victims of a disaster, some of them are bound to be impacted more severely than others. Now, intuitively, distress grants can be made to individuals regardless of whether they're well off or economically disadvantaged. In cases like this, your checking balance is irrelevant. In fact, the IRS concedes that financial condition doesn't matter in a number of cases, including when an individual needs emergency rescue services, when they're stranded, injured, or lost, or suffering because of a flood, fire, accident, or other disaster, and even for counseling during periods of intense grief and help in overcoming legal, financial, and emotional problems caused by the death of a spouse. So let's consider, why would foundations want to make grants to individuals directly instead of passing funds through intermediary organizations? Well, for one, it would allow the foundation to control exactly who will receive aid. By contrast, when you grant through a public charity, you outsource the selection process to that charity. It also may enable you to have a direct impact more quickly. And there may not be a relief organization serving the impacted region, or even if there is one, it may not have boots on the ground, as it were, in all the impacted areas. You may have different selection criteria in mind than the relief organization in the field. Depending on the circumstances and the organization, it may have higher administrative costs than your foundations, and you may save those costs by choosing to make grants directly to individuals from your foundation. And finally, any intermediary organization on the ground may be stretched too thin to make grants to individuals. And so grants made by a private foundation to individuals could help fill in the gap. Now, many are shocked to learn that a foundation can provide disaster relief, even to for-profit businesses, as long as there's a purely charitable purpose being furthered and the circumstances indicate sufficient public benefit. Of course, the elephant in the room is, how is it okay for a charitable foundation to make a grant to a for-profit business? And the answer is that, of course, the business itself isn't the intended target of the foundation's generosity. Rather, the IRS sees the businesses as just the foundation's vehicles through which the foundation can provide help to those who need it. A foundation may provide disaster assistance to a for-profit business if the assistance is a reasonable means of accomplishing a charitable purpose, and any benefit to a private interest is merely incidental, meaning that it's unavoidable in achieving the charitable purpose, and the benefit isn't excessive, meaning that the foundation doesn't benefit the private interest any more than is absolutely necessary to get the job done. For instance, the IRS talks about a scenario where several businesses located in a central business district were destroyed by a tornado, and they lacked the resources or access to conventional financing to begin rebuilding efforts. Without help, the business district would lose these businesses, and the community's residents would lose employment opportunities. In this scenario, the IRS acknowledged that a charity, like a foundation, could provide funds in the form of grants, low-cost loans, or even equity investments in these businesses sufficient to ensure that they remain in the area and continue providing employment opportunities. Once a damaged business has been restored to viability, or a newly attractive business is self-supporting, further assistance to the business from a charity would no longer be appropriate because the benefit to the private interest of the business owners, at that point at least, would outweigh the public benefit. And that's why foundations providing this kind of assistance should have criteria and procedures for monitoring the businesses being helped to determine when a business no longer needs the foundation's help. Back to you, Jolene.
Thanks, Jeff. And that's very helpful, I think, to understand both sides, giving to the non-for-profit 501c public charity and giving to individuals. But just as Zach and Will shared about the need for focus on long-term needs being critical, can you also comment on the abilities of foundations to grant hardship funds, kind of more long-term funds, for example, individuals who might have lost their jobs during an extreme weather event?
Sure. Well, unlike short-term distress relief per the IRS, providing long-term financial assistance to needy families would require a financial need assessment before dispersing aid, the scope of which, again, really should vary depending on the amount of assistance being provided. Importantly, the IRS acknowledges that individuals don't need to be, in their words, totally destitute to be financially needy. Rather, they must be unable to provide for their basic needs. For instance, the regulations provide an example of a private foundation helping a family purchase basic furniture that they otherwise couldn't afford. While providing a simple table could fall under a basic need, providing an inlaid rare wood dining room table imported from Italy would go well beyond providing for a basic need. Also, the IRS requires foundations to use objective and even-handed criteria for selecting one individual or family over another, and the criteria should relate to the grant's charitable purpose. For example, choosing one recipient over another because of the color of the recipient's eyes or hair may be objective, but certainly wouldn't relate to the charitable objective of relieving suffering. On the other hand, giving preference to those without a support network or those who are most fragile and least capable of helping themselves could be valid criteria. So at what point does short-term distress relief transition into longer-term assistance requiring the foundation to take the recipient's financial needs into account? Well, although there's no bright line rule here, it's pretty well accepted that short-term assistance means providing for more than the recipient's immediate needs for just that moment in time. Many take the view that short-term assistance means providing enough to enable the recipients to take care of their basic necessities for 4 to 6 weeks or maybe even longer. Another important rule of thumb to consider is that the larger the grant, the more due diligence is expected of the foundation in terms of vetting the recipient's financial need. Depending on the grant amount, the foundation should ask for references, an accounting of the household's monthly expenses and net income, their net assets, copies of bank credit card or even mortgage statements. Because an individual's or family's needs could hopefully change for the better, it's also important to remember that the foundation should periodically reassess financial need instead of just assuming that financial support could be provided indefinitely once a candidate initially qualifies for assistance. In my experience, a key to a successful hardship assistance program is collaboration. Typically, a foundation will rely on a network of screeners, including clergy, social workers, members of local community organizations, and others who frequently interact with and support the needy to refer suitable candidates for financial assistance. In some cases, their input can be critical, especially when they recommend that the foundation directly pay a candidate's bills, like the rent or the electric bill, because the individual may not be in a position to handle assistance funds responsibly. For instance, if the recipient has a gambling, alcohol, or drug abuse addiction.
Great. Thanks so much. That's very, very helpful. So pivoting a little, Zach and Will, long-term practice leaders, you're both on the ground during the different phases of disaster. And I'll turn to Will first. So Will, we know you arrived back from the Ukraine on Sunday after being there since mid-February. So welcome back. I know our clients and advisors would be so interested to hear directly from you about what you're seeing there and your thoughts on how best people can support. And please also, if you would, share insight on how your long-term approach of leveraging military veterans with combat experience has helped deliver kind of the immediate impact that you're having there.
Well, sure, Jillian. So I think it's two questions. What am I seeing on the ground? And then about the second about leveraging military veterans.
Yep.
So from what I'm seeing on the ground, first and foremost, we focus, our priority is on evacuations, which we're not doing as many as we were as a few weeks ago. It's going to turn to repatriations here soon, as more and more Ukrainians are coming back into the country. But I want to give you what I've seen on the evacuation side, because I think it's important, because to understand the experience of these primarily women and children who are leaving Ukraine for the safety of the rest of Europe. And so, as I said before, we've evacuated over 22,000, primarily women and children, because the men 18 to 60 have been conscripted. And what we've done is tap into an idle network of tourist buses. The tourism industry in Ukraine obviously cradled as soon as the war started. And so these very nice Mercedes-Benz buses were sitting idle. And it was our evacuation coordinator this Ukrainian woman, who's just incredible, who pointed out that we could be using these buses instead of our vans and sedans that we were using for evacuations. And so I want to explain just the experience of the evacuees. They're without, these women and children, without their husbands, their sons, their brothers. If they didn't evacuate when the Russians invaded, for whatever reason, all reasonable, they are evacuating now. They have been, and it's because it's gotten so bad that they didn't have a choice. The Russian military is using war crimes like rape and murder as instruments of policy. Ukrainians are convinced of that, and so am I. We've seen all the evidence of this. The Russians have attacked over 1,000 cultural, religious, educational institutions. The Ukrainians believe this is genocide, as President Biden has said, and I agree with that assessment. Russia is trying to erase Ukrainian culture. And if never again truly means anything, and it's not just some platitude, then I think the world needs to focus on Ukraine and help them defeat the Russian army, because Ukrainians are not going to cede a square foot of soil to potentially end this war. It's going to go on, and the bleeding is going to continue until we provide them enough aid and assistance. But back to the experience of these women and children. They escaped from the north in the beginning, the east now, and the south now, through a network of buses, vans, sedans, but mainly the railways. The railways are the most important means of transportation in Ukraine. The railways are more important than here in the United States. Once they reach the relative safety of Western Ukraine and Lviv, they are now exposed to a network of human traffickers. I've had women refuse to get in my van that I was driving because I'm a man. I've had women ask me if I'm a sex trafficker. They have, at this point, been on the train system for 12 to 48 hours. Their sympathetic nervous system, their fight or flight response is so jacked up after this ordeal. So that's what I'm seeing. Women and children who have been through an incredible amount have survived and are now in the relative safety of other European cities. But the second disaster is coming, and that's the mental health disaster.
Mm-hmm.
On leveraging military veterans, so White Stork, is not a veteran service organization per se like Team Rubicon, but it does happen to consist of many volunteers, the majority of which have served in the military. And serving in the military you have a clear mission or purpose, a clear peer-to-peer support system, you have a clear sense of identity, and you lose those three things when you take off the military uniform. And so it's natural that these men and women who have served in the military are looking for these opportunities to continue to serve because they volunteered. They're looking for more volunteer opportunities, and we're giving that through them, through White Stork, and especially through my prior organization, Team Rubicon. Teamwork, decisive leadership, risk mitigation, emergency medicine. These are skills that veterans have, and that we will continue, and they will continue to look for opportunities to engage them with through disaster response.
Will, as soon as you are, obviously literally boots on the ground there and understand what's going on, you're obviously bumping up against other organizations who are doing some really good work there as well. Can you comment on any of that? Because I know the people on the phone would love to hear your insight.
Absolutely. Well, there's one in particular that I really want to highlight. It's called HARP Rescue. So there are these smaller organizations that aren't well established, but are nonetheless doing the God's work of delivering supplies to the front lines. HARP was founded by a man named Burke Bryant. They are a partner organization of ours who we have used to distribute our medical kits all across the North, the East, and the South, in addition to doing it ourselves. It's organizations like HARP Rescue, which I think that donors should be considering, because this is an organization that was doing something very similar in Afghanistan, helping evacuate our Afghan allies when we pulled out of there. It's an organization that takes calculated risks. And so there are a number of these smaller organizations operating in Ukraine. And I think donors should consider supporting them too, not just these larger aid organizations.
Thanks, Will. So Zach, back to you in SBP. It's focused obviously, as we mentioned earlier, on trying to decrease the time from disaster to recovery. So how is that kind of accomplished, and what progress are you seeing? And then also, rather than interrupt you, if you could kind of comment too on other people who are doing good work in this area to be helpful to the participants on the line.
Thanks, Jillian. Absolutely. And so SBP shifted years ago from a recovery group. We were doing one thing in many communities to a group that couldn't abide folks waiting until we helped them. And when the mission evolved to fortifying people against their breaking point, it required SBP to do other work. And so there's 5 things that we're doing in the field, and we think they're the right things if we're truly trying to get to scaled impact and transformational change, if we don't simply want to keep putting Band-Aids on it and riding into the rescue after people have suffered. And we think that's the right answer for the nonprofit community in general. So the 5 things that we're doing, and there are other groups that do some of these pieces. First of all, we're building in a continuously innovative way. Any building project we're in, we're doing at least one piece that's going to advance the vanguard. A good example is in New Orleans, we built the first, and we have operations all over the country and in the Bahamas, but in New Orleans, we built the first net zero apartment building. So solar panels powering batteries. Half the units are reserved for veterans. It's less than a mile away from the VA hospital. And the theory there was, let's ensure that this gap of affordable housing and the current stock of pretty crummy affordable housing is replaced with resilient, energy efficient, affordable housing. The way that manifested is after Hurricane Ida, where the power was off in Louisiana for up to 4 weeks, people, some of your folks may know, were getting evacuated into these warehouses where they were perishing. Our residents, seniors, veterans, people with some challenges, had cool air through air conditioning and hot water through electricity. So we're doing something innovative anywhere we're rebuilding. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we have a Marine, Will, Andy Stoffleth. I don't know if you ever knew him. He runs our Caribbean work, and we're building construction bricks out of volcanic ashes that have devastated this island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So 1, we're building in an innovative way that bakes in resilience. 2, we're supporting other nonprofit groups. The truth is, if we're embracing what we call at SBP the mom rule, So if our mothers were impacted, we wouldn't care if it was the people in the blue shirts or the yellow shirts or the gray shirts or the green shirts who's building their houses. So we're raising efficacy across the nonprofit industry. We're investing, last year we invested $4.5 million. This year, the target is higher into other nonprofit groups while also teaching them the Toyota production system, investing AmeriCorps members into them as well. 3, we're driving resilience and helping people navigate recovery at a scaled level. We don't want people to have to turn to SBP or any other nonprofit at their moment of peril and say, I can't do it on my own. So we're helping folks understand what they can do to become more resilient before disaster, and then how to navigate recovery, maximize FEMA, avoid contractor fraud. Indeed, we have a FEMA appellate clinic where each employee there is leveraging $1.5 million of FEMA funds that people wouldn't have gotten otherwise. 4th, we're advising city and state governments. You know, again, we don't want people to have to go to the last resort of humbling themselves before this nonprofit group they've never known before. We want it to work for them quicker. So we're training city and state governments to access the federal money and get it out the door quicker. As part of that, we're launching in Louisiana the country's first bridge loan fund that will advance private dollars to individuals to rebuild their own homes, that will then be reimbursed through the federal process once the states and cities are running the community development block grant programs. Often it takes 2 to 3 years for the federal dollars to start hitting the grounds for people. People with means can be reimbursed to the extent that they'll later qualify and that they have their own funds to spend. But as we spoke about earlier, we don't want to, and that works extraordinarily well. We don't want to take that vehicle away from those who are availing themselves, but it's important that it works for all Americans, especially the unbankable. And so we're launching this first fund that is fantastic. And then finally, we have an advocacy role. What we're seeing is through the government's desires and frankly, philanthropists' requirements, that we're baking in resilience to every stage of recovery. As one of my colleagues, Elizabeth Egley says, it's too expensive to build back cheaply. Now, the goal isn't build in an ostentatious way. Toyota has a phrase though, jidoka, it's built-in quality. When we're rebuilding homes, they have to be rebuilt in a way that will withstand the future perils. I think, Jillian, you were asking me other groups that are doing fantastic work. I would guide people to the First Street Foundation and their website. Everyone on this call should plug in their home address into First Street and see if you have the proper insurance for the perils that could predictably imperil your home. They're doing fantastic work over there. There are local Habitat for Humanities that are doing game-changing work. SBP is funding and training many of them. Those are some groups that I would certainly point out to.
Great. Thanks, Zach.
Thank you.
While we're waiting for maybe some questions to come in, how is the work? I'm presuming the work has changed in recent years due to the current challenges and dynamics. I mean, you know, COVID, extreme weather, continuing, social media. Any advice for funders on, you know, how to kind of navigate that and still do it right, if you like? Will or Zach, if you could take that.
Will, would you like to go first?
Well, I'd love to just pick up first, if I could, have something that Zach said before, because, look, what I've always liked about Zach Rosenberg is that he looks to organizational leaders who are not making it about themselves, and he helps lift them up. And so if he sees someone that is, has an interesting model, and they're doing work, he will, he will bring them in, partner with them, provide them financing like SBP has for us in Ukraine, to purchase things like tourniquets and medical kits. But those best practices that you're talking about and leading to better outcomes, I wanted to focus on two things, if I could, is that one, for us in Ukraine, it was about focusing on the railways. Yes, we're running a network of buses, but the railways are still the safest and most important way to evacuate civilians across Ukraine. And however, those railways are still being targeted by Russian missiles. And so what we have done at the request of the head of the railways, Alexander Kemishin, is provide individual or basic first aid kits for all 1,200 railway cars. And in addition to that, we are with Envision Healthcare, the largest healthcare staffing clinical company in the United States, providing training to the railway staff so they know how to use those medical kits when their train cars get hit by missiles and when they have injuries. So that has been our kind of lesson learned in focus on what's working and how can we support. And because we were already alongside our partners, Ukraine friends, providing these first aid kits, we decided to really focus on the railways in terms of what's the best way that we can provide support to the Ukrainian people. The second thing is introduce strong accounting controls early. And this was a mistake that we made early on in Team Rubicon on our very first operation in Haiti, where we didn't have an accounting team in place. And so one of the very first things we did at White Stork was ensure we had a network of, right now they're all volunteers, bookkeepers and accountants who are ensuring that we have the proper accounting controls. We are closing books at the end of the month. We are collecting receipts, and we're doing that because we have the intention of building this and showing donors that we're running this like a business.
Excellent. Thanks, Will.
Yeah, so I think focusing on outcomes. So if I had advice for funders, Jillian, on how to do it right, I think a ruthless or tenacious focus on outcomes and a comfort co-joined with a comfort evaluating some of the legacy partners. There's a timeliness where a bigger organization at various phases of our country's history might have been the right answer, but now nimbleness and laser focus on outcomes are what's required. Two, I would look to entities that can't tolerate the current state that's driving them to do more than react. Sure, we've got to stop the bleeding, but if we can prevent the harm in the first place and look to organizations that are driving system change, I think that's both a cultural indicia of an entity that's going to be running itself like a business and hard driving for results, and one that's going to drive the scaled impact that's required. Third, I think get to know the leadership in the team and probe for whether there's a culture of curiousness and talking about problems, or simply saying that everything's sunny. Whether it's from good to great, where they talked about Hewlett Packard flipping over the rocks, or at SBP, we really started getting efficient when Toyota taught us an essential part of the Toyota production system is about talking about problems. And if you can find organizations that just don't talk about external problems, but embrace surface internal problems, you're going to find a group that is going to be more effective in driving to the outcomes
that's very helpful,
that we've just got to achieve.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions, which I think were kind of interesting. So this is really for you, Will. So question, it would appear that the Ukraine invasion will cause a global food crisis in the long term. Any thoughts as to how we can avoid donor fatigue and respond to this pending crisis?
Wow, that's a hard question for me to answer, especially with my head so so focused in Ukraine. I go back to, I guess, what I said earlier. I think, and I appreciate, as a charity leader, I appreciate the sentiment, the feeling of donors of wanting to get involved and do something right away. But I would ask for more patience from donors to consider this whole disaster cycle, as Zach explained and showed earlier, because you can be more intentional with your your funds, and think about how can we spread out this wealth that we have over that disaster cycle. How could you focus your intention to a potentially better way to use those funds by understanding how that cycle works. And as we introduce new challenges, be it a global hunger, shortage of food, monkeypox, there's no shortage of challenges today. And we need donors to understand that just like in Ukraine, never again, if that means anything, then we need them to show up today. But there's going to be other challenges. And so we need to consider the full cycle of how we're going to solve these problems is Zach laid out.
Thanks, Will. Jeff, if we could just turn back to you for a minute, because we were talking a lot about best practices leading to better outcomes. How kind of foundations need to be careful here about following the rules? Because this, in sometimes it's kind of uncharted territory a little bit. So can you make a couple of points on that for us?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, the foundation shouldn't provide assistance to family members or other close relatives of its directors, officers, trustees, and major funders. In fact, the foundation has to maintain records to document any relationship its insiders may have to its grant recipients and how the foundation even came to learn of the recipient's needs. That doesn't mean that you can't help people that you know necessarily, but certainly not only people that you know. And so while a foundation providing short-term distress relief would have scaled down expectations of the sort of records it would maintain in connection with distress grants, it would still be expected to maintain at least a log of the type of assistance provided, the criteria for dispersing assistance, the date, place, and estimated number of people who were assisted. On the other hand, more detailed records would be expected to be maintained for longer-term assistance where the need is not as imminent as pressing. And finally, remember that the IRS requires a grant-making foundation to make its annual return open to public inspection, and only with limited exceptions is required to disclose a grant recipient's identity and address, the grant amount, and a description of the grant purpose. Now, the penalties for granting to insiders could be as much as 10% of the penalty. And in a case like that, the penalty wouldn't be paid by the foundation. It would be paid by the insider, and the insider would have to give the money back. On the other hand, the rules around proper procedures for making grants to individuals, assessing need and the like, and making sure it's not excessive, that could lead to a 20% penalty on foundations that don't follow those rules at all. So, sure.
Great. As we're coming up towards the end of our panel discussion today, so I think in closing, can we kind of, each one of you, leave the audience with one idea, one key consideration to consider as they evaluate or formulate their approach to giving in these times of crisis? I'll start with you, Zach.
Sure. One thing that we speak about with significant donors is about challenge grants that will have a result in lessening the need of the work that we're doing. Will funders consider contributing more money over a shorter period of time with the understanding that unless we're reducing the need, no further funds will come? You know, there's far too much, I think, comfort and bloat in the nonprofit world of growing in response instead of prophylactically reducing the need. And if there's true loyalty to the client base, we think that's something that's important. So that is a bigger idea that certainly I'd be happy to unpack further, but I think can apply in a number of industries. Will can't stop the war. So I wouldn't necessarily apply it to war crisis work.
Right, I got you. Thanks, Zach. Will?
Yeah, thanks, Jillian. And I'm going to underscore a previous point I made about that this is a never again moment, in my opinion. There is war in Europe. This will metastasize if it's not stopped and supported. If we don't support and give our Ukrainian partners the support they need. And as I said, if never again was just a platitude, and I don't think it is, it was, we need the support of the entire community of the United States and donors to support organizations who are there supplying key humanitarian aid to our Ukrainian partners. One of our donors said something to me that I thought was actually pretty profound. He said, "This is a war run on donations. That's kind of messed up."
Mm.
And I sat with it and I was, wow. As I'm here in Chicago, getting ready to go back in a few weeks, collecting body armor from people in my church because the Ukrainians can't purchase it, collecting individual first aid kits, collecting radios because they don't have the funds. This is a war run on donations. It is a never again moment. And I just ask donors to consider what they are going to do to ensure that this genocide is stopped.
Thank you, Will. Jeff.
Well, if you think about what everyone said so far, I'd sum it up with it takes a village. By that, I mean, to really be effective and to run a charity like a business is the key. And it's all about partnership and collaboration. Like no one can do it all by themselves. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of resources, a waste of money. Why duplicate efforts? People have different skills, different abilities, different resources. So if you could really think about it and reach out, who's in the area already? What are they doing? What are their needs? Where can I fill in where there's an interstice, where there's a need that's not being met? So really to reach the people and the most people and be most effective, I think it's really keep in mind, no one can do it alone. It takes a village. Reach out, collaborate, lead the way, perhaps fill in gaps, and by all means make a difference with your partners.
Thank you, Jeff. So thank you very much, Zach, Will, Jeff. Appreciate your insights so much and for sharing your expertise. People have asked if they wanted to donate, could we send them the information? We will certainly do that when we're sending out the recording. And in the next couple of days, we will be sending out a recording of the webinar. People will get that, everyone who signed up for this presentation. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you again to our panelists. And this concludes our webinar. Thank you very much.